Good day and thank you for joining CivilNet. Today we'll be discussing films and what they represent, how they perceived, and why we decided to have this topic, this discussion, is firstly the Mosaic of Human Stories. It's an American film showcase in Armenia that's not only in Yerevan, also going around in other cities. And we have guests from the USC School of Cinematic Arts, Alessandro Ago. You are the Programming and Special Projects Director there, and you're here with this special showcase screening in Yerevan. Tell us a little bit about the program, please, and I'm really looking forward to ask you about your impressions from Gyumri and Vanadzor.
Sure, absolutely. The American Film Showcase is an annual collection that we curate at the School of Cinematic Arts that brings together about 40 to 45 feature films, documentaries, and short films that represent what we think of as a very strong representation of contemporary documentaries and films coming out of the United States, independent films, that we like to offer to countries around the world as an opportunity for us to share strong human stories that we think might offer a bridge to discussion between local audiences and filmmakers. Things that might highlight facets of the United States that hadn't really been shown here before, or things that are really common themes, common human problems that we face. And we also hope to stimulate more local film students, communication students, to think about documentary as a way of telling their own stories, of telling more stories about their communities, their countries. So we also try and bring filmmakers who work with young students to make short projects or workshop scripts, things like that. And
how has been the reaction so far?
Here? It's been fantastic. The film that we brought, actually the showcase here, Mosaic of Human Stories, is one of the most ambitious film showcase programs I've seen anywhere in the world, because the team here from the U.S. Embassy has actually decided to show almost our entire catalog of films over the course of 2 months at the Moscow Center, at other locations like the Club, at Tumo, and so there's really a great variety of the movies that we're screening. But in particular, this week we're here with filmmaker Janet Grillo with her film Jack of the Red Hearts, which is a narrative drama about a young woman who kind of finds her way. She sort of infiltrates a family by posing as a healthcare provider for a young child with autism. And so she's an imposter. But because she's sort of scared and she needs money, she lies to this family, pretends to be a healthcare provider for this young girl who has very severe autism. But through the film redeems herself, learns to love the child, to admit to her mistakes, helps the family, and then takes responsibility for her actions. And this film was important for us because we feel like a lot of places, including the United States, still don't really talk about the problems surrounding the care of people with autism. And it's very diverse. People, because there are some people that have a fairly less debilitating autism that allows them to function in society socially with independent living, and then there's others that have very debilitating autism and need constant supervision, care, empathy, understanding, and those, because it's such a widespread spectrum of a condition, it doesn't get talked about very often because people misunderstand what it is.
It's a problem we have in Armenia, I'm sure, very deeply. People, mentally challenged people, physically challenged people never get enough attention. But this kind of I was thinking as you were talking as to In comparison to films from America that might come to Armenia, with certain feel-good also endings, I suppose, what kind of films would you take to America from Armenia or the region?
What kind of films would I bring?
Because in my imagination, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the times when we make documentaries, we talk about problems and we're not at the point of very feel-good documentary. And when the world is hearing us, we want to just like really talk about our problems, as like see what problems we have. There's poverty, this is a person, this is homeless. Gyumri is people... Since the earthquake, there are people who still don't live in temporary shelters. We're always like, it's almost like an SOS from Armenia, anything that's going on. Is that your impression?
What I would say is, documentaries can penetrate any border if they have one thing, a human story that you care about. And through those kinds of characters, you can talk about anything. So if you wanted to bring a film about Gyumri, I wouldn't bring sort of a newsreel footage about the earthquake and statistics and reconstruction. I would tell it through the eyes of maybe someone who was a child when it happened, and 20 years later, 30 years later, how have they contributed back to their society by trying to rebuild the city, and what are they doing? Or family members that were split apart, some that chose to leave, some that chose to stay.
It's always a human story,
it's
as you
all
said.
Because the human condition is universal. It's only the specifics of where we are and where we grew up, the culture that we're in, that may be different from someone who lives across the ocean.
So for decades now, Armenia has been struggling with telling the genocide story. Every documentary, every piece, every movie that comes out, it's not good enough. Firstly, judged by Armenians. Everyone's not happy with that. I mean, with your expertise and your knowledge of films, I mean, what is this telling of, or if you've seen any of them, what's your evaluation?
I honestly think you just need to start telling the story more and more. There is no such thing as the perfect representation of history. It's just impossible because there's too many points of view, there's too many facts that may be wrong, or points of view that might be contradictory. So even if you make a film that is so historically well researched and accurate, you might not have the same emotional connection as if you made certain dramatic decisions to tell the story through a couple of main characters to attract an emotional response from the viewer.
On the other hand, sometimes they say about some movies they're overly emotionalized.
Well,
and it's
emotionally
too much of a love
sentimental.
story now. Yes.
So it's a very complex thing. You can't sometimes with something of this nature, which is of such historical importance to understand, the intellectual and the academic side and the sentimental, emotional side are almost impossible to reconcile. And I think an audience would prefer the emotional side, and the critic would prefer the academic side. The historians would prefer that. And I think that this has been seen in a lot of historical dramas over decades of cinema, particularly in the way that World War II has been represented. And I say that as the World War II, not necessarily specifically the Holocaust. There have been hundreds and hundreds of films made about this. And so you get to the point where a movie can have a very specific point of view and tell a very small story that you haven't heard yet, because it doesn't have to tell the entire story of the history of World War II. Now, as far as the genocide that happened, the Holocaust that happened in World War II, that, as opposed to World War II movies, was a lot more of a loaded issue. And it took a filmmaker of the international stature of Steven Spielberg to really make the big, comprehensive story, and even that was not enough. At the time, someone considered to be the best filmmaker in the world from a commercial standpoint told the story very much in the same storytelling structure as he would have told any number of his commercial science fiction films, with sentimentality, with a sort of an uplifting ending, despite the horrors that happen, with a sweeping musical score, with beautiful cinematography, things that may be too. It's sort of the seduction of cinema. You know, it's too beautiful to represent the Holocaust. You know, you need to appreciate. You know, it's not reality because it's so stylized. And then recently we got a film called Son of Saul that was potentially the inverse of Schindler's List, in that it was a film told from one character's point of view in one continuous shot, going through the concentration camp. So it's not stylized in the same way. It's not relying on music and editing and cinematography. I mean, it is, but not in the same way.
To that extent, yes.
And so I think what that tells us is there is no one film that will ever be made that will satisfy the emotional and the intellectual needs of people who want to see this story told. The Armenian Genocide.
But, and also, as you started answering this question, more work needs to be done. More stories, more films, more documentaries need to be made until we get to a point where, more or less, collectively the story is told from the different perspectives and the different, with different approaches. We're at just the beginning.
With the amount of people who died and suffered and were exiled or managed to survive and stay here, every single one of those is a story. So how on earth could you put the weight of telling the Armenian Genocide story into one film? It has to be, the more specific the story, the more you learn the diversity of the experience that people went through.
Back to Gyumri and Vanazor, please share with us your impressions. An American film screening, a series of screenings in Gyumri. What were the reactions? How did people come to react to the screenings? I understand there were also question and answers there.
Right. So we had a very young audience, which is always a pleasure, because we're getting a chance to sort of see what the next generation of potential filmmakers and potential writers and just, you know, understanding what concerns them about their society today, and media makers, I should call them. And so we had a full house, you know, a few hundred people, mostly 15 to 18-year-olds, a lot of women. And they were very interested. I mean, they came to the screening, and then they engaged the filmmaker, and it seemed like they were very interested in learning about care of people with autism. That's a response to the film that's very much about empathy with the character. In fact, there haven't been a lot of questions that we've encountered about filmmaking. It's usually been very focused on the drama of the story, and how the filmmaker also has a child with autism, and how that experience influenced the stories that she tells, and the way that she works with actors, and the way that her message is nuanced to, you know, to reflect the experiences that she's had as a mother. And so that to me has been very interesting. There's obviously a much different conversation that could happen in Q&As, where people are talking about, you know, tell us about the cinematography, or
yes,
you know,
or how do I get the funding to make a movie?
Where did you raise the money?
Yeah.
But the students have been very interested in the issue of people with autism.
The subject matter. I was looking and researching you naturally, but also I saw that you taught a course that's Transnational Nightmares and Filmmaking. Oh, yeah. I mean, this title is just really interesting. What's Transnational Nightmares and Filmmaking?
Sure. I love that title, and I love designing the artwork for the course syllabus, which was, you know, sort of a representation of this idea. I wanted to take a look at horror films, hence the nightmares part of it. I wanted to take a look at horror films across three major categories. The first one being, okay, let me back up. Horror films as a genre are very, very effective at communicating the issues and anxieties of the countries that produce them. And I will give you a very, I think, easy example. Godzilla comes out of Japan in the wake of the nuclear devastation caused by the atomic bomb. So you get a series of horror films about, you know, this giant creature destroying Tokyo as a result of anxieties over the mutations and health concerns over the radiation from the fallout from the nuclear explosion. And this happens in horror films all over the place. So I wanted to take a look at horror genres within their countries and what do they reflect about their societies at that moment in time. And then I wanted to take a look at transnational genres. What happens when you look at something like the zombie film and you analyze it between the United States, Great Britain, Italy, China, you know, New Zealand, Malaysia? How do the changes to the genre reflect back on the society? And there's been a lot of really interesting comparisons to make in the zombie genre, which is very, I think, very ripe for interpretation, because in America it might be nuclear, in Italy it might be religious, in Great Britain it might be scientific, you know. So it's, you know, in other countries it's voodoo, you know, it's all over the place, but it changes depending on how it would relate to the fears that someone might have. So
I don't know that Armenians are making zombie movies here or any horror movies, but I wonder what kind of horror story it would be if we were to produce a... What do you think?
I would expect it to be very steeped in Christianity because religion always plays a very specific role in people's fears. And then I think that it would probably deal with the trauma of the genocide, although maybe not.
That wouldn't be acceptable to mix the horror genre.
This is why horror film is useful, because it's a series of metaphors, meaning that it can deal with something without ever talking about it. They don't talk about nuclear explosions in
Yes.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Godzilla. It's implicit. It's a metaphor that you understand represents a trauma. So a horror film could easily deal with issues of genocide without actually talking about it. And that's why it's subversive, that's why it's popular, because it sort of allows you to have this sort of visceral response to what you're watching, and then you leave the theater and you feel better, you know? And that's the same with comedies, science fiction, as opposed to drama, where it's like, it's so explicit, the relationship between the viewer and the story, that, you know, you're not supposed to have this catharsis the way that a genre film, you know, gives you.
All right, good luck with the screenings. I understand they continue until March 31st.
Yeah, there's a lot of great films.
Yes, so to our viewers who are in Yerevan, go check them out. You'll find, I'm sure you'll find the program online if you look for it. And thank you for joining us. And to the filmmakers, produce more. Possibilities are endless.
That's the only way you're going to get past the issue of one film having to represent the entire genocide, is more, more, more.
Good luck.